Hello everybody. Well, the beauty of doing church from home is that we can do church wherever we like. So this morning, if like me, you're in your bed, welcome. And I want to share a story with you that involves someone having a dream, which is why I'm in my bed. We're going to do 3 stories this morning, and they are all about characters called Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So let's get on with our first story. Our first story takes place with a king called King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar had called for young, wise, and fit men to enter and serve in his household. And so he had brought Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego into his household to serve him. And at this time, Nebuchadnezzar woke up one morning. And he woke up with a bit of a shock, going, "Oh, that dream was a little intense." And he realised that this dream that he was having was a dream that had a meaning that needed interpreting. It wasn't just any old dream. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he called all his wise men and his astrologers to him in his palace. And he had a little suspicion that they would try and fob him off with an interpretation for his dream. So he decided that he wasn't going to tell them what the dream was, but that he would ask them to tell him what the dream was and then interpret it. And if they didn't, he would cut them into pieces and destroy their homes. So no pressure on the wise men there at all. So he brings the men into his palace, and he explains the situation to them. And quite rightly, the wise men kind of look at him and go, "You what? What you're asking is impossible. Nobody can do that. Nobody can tell you what a dream is and interpret it." And he says to them, "Look, I know you're just trying to buy time here. You know that you're not going to be able to interpret my dream, and you know what will happen to you if that is the case. So you're just trying to buy time. Stop messing about and somebody tell me, what does my dream mean?" And the astrologers say to him again, "Look, King, what you are asking for is impossible. Nobody can do this." And at this, King Nebuchadnezzar becomes absolutely furious. He is so angry. And so he determines that all the wise men in the kingdom will be executed. And he sends his commander Arioch out to go and round up all these wise men and bring them for execution. Now, Arioch, of course, has to go and get Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they're some of the wise men as well. And when he goes to Daniel, Daniel says to him, "Well, hang on, this is a really harsh verdict from the king. Give me some time with the king and let me see if I can interpret the dream." So Daniel somehow manages to get time with the king and say to him, I think I can do this for you. Just hold off on executing all these wise men. Give me a little bit of time to interpret the dream. And if I can't, fair enough, go ahead. But if I can, then we'll save the lives of all these wise men. So amazingly, the king agrees. And Daniel goes off to try and interpret the dream. So he gathers with him Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the 4 of them, they sit and they pray to God. And they say to God, "Look, God, we know you're a great God. You have done some amazing things. You are the revealer of mysteries. And we know you are king of all this earth. Please, please, please." They pretty much plead with him, "Please give us the interpretation for this dream." And so sometime later, Daniel goes and finds Arioch, and he says to him, "I have an interpretation for the dream. Please take me to the king." And so Daniel finds himself in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, which must have been a pretty scary experience for him, by the fact that he knows that God is on his side. And so he says to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Look, King, what you are asking of these wise men is not possible. No man on this earth could tell you what this dream is and interpret the dream. But God is a revealer of mysteries, and he has shown me that your dream was of a large statue made out of 4 different types of metal. And while you watched this statue, a large rock came up from the earth and was thrown at the statue and smashed the statue to pieces. And what this dream means is that there will be kingdoms that come after yours. The next kingdom after yours will be inferior to yours. The kingdom after that will be a great kingdom that will rule the whole earth. And the kingdom after that will be a kingdom that lasts forever." For King What God has shown you, He has shown you the future. He has shown you his plan and what will happen and how he intends to raise up a kingdom that will smash all others, and that will be the kingdom that rules forever. And when the king heard these words and heard Daniel tell him what his dream had been, he was amazed, and he fell prostrate at Daniel's feet, and he said, "Surely your God is God of gods and the King of kings and the revealer of mysteries." And he was so amazed by what Daniel's God had shown him that he promoted Daniel within his household. And he made Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego rulers within his kingdom as well. And he poured all manner of gifts on top of them. And the wise men who had been doomed with execution were allowed to live. So what happened there? What do we want to learn from that story? We want to learn from that story that when God is on your side, you can do amazing things. Nothing can stand in your way. Daniel could not have interpreted that dream on his own, but with God standing with him, he was able to interpret the dream for the king and to bring forth God's kingdom into that king's kingdom. When God is for you, no one can stand against you. What a wonderful story about how God can be for us. Now, that kind of reminds me of a song about how great God is. Now, if you're in Bubbles and Splash, you know what's coming next. So come on, let's lead the way, Bubbles and Splash crew. Everybody off the sofas, out of bed, get stood on your feet. We're going to sing a song. So you have to warm yourself up because we're going to do some actions. So warm your arms up, give them a shake. Warm your body up, give that a shake. Wiggle your legs, waggle that leg, give yourselves a good old shake. And now you're ready for singing. Let's go.
Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and he holds us in his hands. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and he holds us in his hands. He's higher than a skyscraper, and he's deeper than a submarine. He's wider than the universe and beyond my wildest dreams. And he's known me and he's loved me since before the world began. How wonderful to be a part of God's amazing plan. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and he holds us in his hands. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and he holds us in his hands. He's higher than a skyscraper, and he's deeper than a submarine. He's wider than the universe and beyond my wildest dreams. And he's known me and he's loved me since before the world began. How wonderful to be a part of God's amazing plan. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and he holds us in his hands. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and he holds us in his hands. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and he holds us in his hands. 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 And he holds us in his hands.
Welcome back for part 2 of our story. Now, before we start, there are a couple of things I need to let you know. Number 1, you'll notice there's some balloons on the table. There will be popping balloons later on in the video, so when you see the gold balloon, you might want to just put your fingers in your ears for a little while. The second thing is, there's going to be fire in this video, so don't try this at home. And I do have a scientist who's going to help me out with all the science bits. Now, let's think back to our first story that we heard just before. At the end of that story, King Nebuchadnezzar had realised that Daniel's God was the God of God, the King of Kings, and the revealer of mysteries. And he had bowed down in front of Daniel and recognised that and worshipped God. But this story, this takes place some years later. And King Nebuchadnezzar has forgotten all of that. And in fact, he's just built a really large image, a statue of gold. And he called all his governors and the people that ruled his kingdom to him. And he said to them, I want you to give a message out to the people. This is what I command. And my command is this. When the harps and the lyres and the flutes and the horns start playing, and there is music, then the people must bow down and they must worship the image of gold. And if they do not worship the image of gold, then they'll be thrown into the blazing, fiery furnace. Dun, dun, dun! So, the rulers of the different parts of the kingdom and the governors and the people, they went out and they told all their people, the king has given an order. The king has said, when the music plays, and the harps and the horns and the flutes and the lyres start playing, you must bow down and you must worship the big gold statue. Otherwise, you'll be thrown into the blazing, fiery furnace. So, a little bit of time went by, and then the music started playing, and all the people bowed down and worshipped the big gold statue, and everything was fine and hunky-dory and wonderful. Yeah, except it didn't quite work out like that, because actually there were 3 people, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who did not bow down and did not worship the statue. And a couple of the governors noticed this, and so they went to the king and they said to the king, King, there are 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who did not bow down and worship the golden statue. You must throw them into the flaming, blazing, fiery furnace. Now the king at this point, he was furious. His neck bulged and his eyes bulged and he went nearly purple and he's furious at Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and he called for them to be brought to him. And he said to them, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, I am furious with you. Why did you not bow down and worship my big golden statue? He was not on their side. He was totally against what they had done. Now, thankfully, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego knew that God was on their side. And so they said to the king, not that we think we should defend ourselves, but actually, we believe that even if you do throw us into the blazing fiery furnace, our God will rescue us. And you know what? Even if he doesn't, we're still not bowing down and worshipping your big gold statue. Well, if you thought the king was angry and furious before, now he was raging. How dare you? And he ordered the blazing fiery furnace to be made 7 times hotter than normal. 7 times hotter. And he said to his soldiers, he said, take Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, bind their hands and their feet together, take them into the furnace and make sure they are fully clothed still and have their turbans on their head. Take them in like that. So, the soldiers, the strongest in the king's army, took Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego into the blazing fiery furnace that was 7 times hotter than normal. And of course, shall we see what happened to the soldiers. But the king, who had been furious, suddenly, amazed, because he'd sent 1, 2, 3 people into the blazing fiery furnace, but now, hang on a moment, there were 1, 2, 3, 4 people wandering around in the blazing fiery furnace, no longer were their hands and feet bound. They were walking around freely in the blazing fiery furnace, and the king was amazed, because what had Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego said? Men who knew that God was for them. They said, if you send us into the blazing fiery furnace, our God will rescue us. So, King Nebuchadnezzar, seeing this, he calls out Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego from the blazing fiery furnace, and he says to them, oh, your God is trustworthy and true, and he's rescued you just like you said he would. And he fell down and he worshipped God again, just like he had with Daniel when Daniel interpreted the dream. And he made Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego even more important in his kingdom. But the most amazing thing he did was that he made everyone in his kingdom, when the music played, bow down, not to the big gold statue, but to the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And so Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were made more important in the kingdom and given more responsibility. And they knew, and now Nebuchadnezzar knew, that God was for them. And so we find ourselves in Story Corner for story number 3. So let's just recap. So we've had the story of Nebuchadnezzar, the king, who had a crazy mad dream, and Daniel interpreted it because God was for Daniel. And he was on his side, and so he saved him from being chopped into lots of little pieces and having his house turned to rubble when he gave Daniel the interpretation for the dream. And so Nebuchadnezzar began to praise Daniel's God. And then some years passed and Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten what had happened, and instead he built a statue of God and demanded everybody worship it. And when Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego said that they wouldn't do, he tried to burn them in the blazing fiery furnace, but God was for them and he was with them, and he protected them from that fire and delivered them from it. And again King Nebuchadnezzar bowed down and worshipped the God of Daniel, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. And then a time came, just as had been predicted in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where he died and the next kingdom came that was his son. And that was an inferior kingdom. And it didn't last very long before his own son died. And so we find ourselves now at the beginning of story number 3. And story number 3 sees us with a new king, King Darius, who was a little open to persuasion from the men around him. So for story number 3, we've got a treat for you. Here comes a cartoon.
Stories of the Bible. Daniel in the Lion's Den. This is Daniel.
Oh, hey!
Who was a Jewish man who was taken to Babylon when he was very young.
Yeah.
Daniel loved God and followed God's rules. He talked to God 3 times a day and asked God for help often. Daniel served in the Babylonian king's court for many years.
Yeah, I know him.
And under many kings.
Hey, Daniel.
Daniel always proved himself to be more capable than all the other court officials.
Thanks. Well, anytime.
Daniel was serving under King Darius, and because of his great abilities, the king made plans to place him in charge of the entire empire.
Wow, okay.
The other court officials searched for some fault in Daniel, but they couldn't find anything wrong with him. He was faithful, responsible, and completely trustworthy.
Wait.
The court officials realized the only way to get at Daniel would be to challenge his faith.
Come on.
So they went to King Darius
Excuse me, Your Majesty.
and advised him to make a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone except King Darius will be thrown into the lion's den.
I like it.
King Darius signed this law, and once a Babylonian king signed a law, it could not be overruled. When Daniel learned of this law, he went home and knelt down, as he always did, to pray in his room with the windows open towards Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he always had done, giving thanks to God and asking for his help. The officials went to Daniel's house and found him praying.
Gotcha.
They went to the king and reminded him of the law.
I remember.
Well,
Then they said that Daniel had been found praying to God 3 times a day.
What?
When the king heard this, he was very upset,
Get over here.
and he spent the whole day trying to think of a way to save Daniel.
wait, what?
By that evening, the court officials came back to the king and reminded him that no law signed by the Babylonian king could be overruled. So at last, the king gave orders for Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den. The king said to him, "May your God, who you serve faithfully, rescue you." Then the lion's den was sealed shut with Daniel inside. The king spent the night fasting and couldn't sleep. Then very early in the morning, the king hurried to the lion's den. He called out,
Hey, Daniel.
"Was your God able to rescue you from the lions?" And Daniel answered, "Long live the king! My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight." The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be taken out of the lion's den. Then the king ordered the men who had schemed against Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den as punishment. Daniel was safe. There was not a scratch on him, for he trusted in God.
So I really hope that you enjoyed our 3 stories. So now here we come to the conclusion. And we see that, well, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they went through some pretty terrifying things. There were crazy kings with weird old dreams who wanted to cut them into small, tiny pieces. And there were blazing, fiery furnaces. And there were lions' dens. And yet God was for them throughout that. Throughout all those terrifying things, God was with them each and every one of those situations. Crazy kings could not get to them when God was on their side. God didn't leave them to perish in the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar. No, he gave them the boldness to step forward, knowing that he was with them no matter how tough it got. Right now in our lives, we're going through some pretty terrifying and different things that no one else will have been through. And now whether you're 90 or 9 or 90, more now than ever, we need to know that God is on our side and that he is for us. So this morning I have a question for you. What is your blazing fiery furnace? What is your lion's den? What is the thing that right now is terrifying you or causing you to be anxious? You do know that God is for you, right? That God is with us every step of every single little terrifying way that we might take or anxious thought that we might have. The words, "if God is for us, then who can be against us?" come from Romans. And Romans was written by Paul. And Paul was someone who knew what he was chatting about. Paul had been through more terrifying things than any of us could ever really hope to ever go through. Paul had been shipwrecked. And Paul had been bitten by a snake. And Paul had been thrown in jail. And we can only hope that none of us will go through all the things that Paul went through. But yet, in everything, he knew that he could confidently say, because of his trust in God, if God is for me, then who can be against me? And just a few little verses later, Paul again writes, he says, neither life nor death, nor angels, nor demons, nor present or the future, nor any powers, nor anything else in all of creation can separate us from the love of God. God doesn't abandon us when we're at our most vulnerable or at our weakest or at our most terrified. It's in those times that we can learn to confidently say, if God is for us, then who or what can possibly be against us? We can find our confidence and our hope in God. Now, all those things that I just read, neither life nor death nor angels nor demons, all of them were conquered by Jesus when he died on the cross. And that's why, and that's how we can have this hope and this confidence in God, that these things cannot harm us or separate us from God's love. So back to that question. What is your blazing fiery furnace? What is your lion's den? I'm sure we're all thinking of individual things right now. Maybe it's related around to coronavirus. Maybe you're anxious or terrified about going back to work or school after lockdown. You know, what will it be like? Who will actually be there? You know, how will it all happen? Will it ever be the same as it was? Or maybe your fear and what you are terrified of has nothing to do with coronavirus. Maybe it's more personal to you. Paul writes in the last little section of Romans 8 that we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. And that is for us, is our reality, that Jesus loved us so much that we have absolutely nothing to fear when God is for us, because nothing can separate us from that love of God. So the only question remains is, do you have the confidence and the hope in God to step out and face your challenges? I wanted to motivate you today. And it's been really hard knowing how to pull this all-age service together and make it work and whether it would reach everybody. And we've probably failed in some ways. But we wanted to give you a confidence and a hope in God. We wanted to bring you to a place where you could say, God is for me. And I know that, and I truly believe that. And we're going to pray shortly. But first, we're going to present you with a song called God is For Us. And we want you to use this time, it's just 3 minutes. Use this time and this anthem of a song to build your confidence and build your hope and reflect on the words and the stories and the verses that you've heard today. Because God is for you. He is for each and every single lovely one of you. So believe that.
Fear the battle, we won't fear the night. We will walk the valley with you by our side. You will go before us, you will lead the way. We have found a refuge, only you can save. Sing with joy now, our God is for us. The Father's love is a strong and mighty fortress. Raise your voice now, no love is greater. Who can stand against us if our God is for us? Even when I stumble, even when I fall, even when I turn back, still your love is sure. You will not abandon, you will not forsake. You will cheer me onward with never-ending grace. Sing with joy now, our God is for us. The Father's love is a strong and mighty fortress. Raise your voice now, no love is greater. Who can stand against us if our God is for us? Separate us, hell and death will not defeat us. He who gave his Son to free us holds me in his love. Neither height nor depth can separate us. Hell and death will not defeat us. He who gave his Son to free us holds me in his love. Sing with joy now, our God is for us. The Father's love is a strong and mighty fortress. Raise your voice now, your love is greater. Who can stand against us if our God is for us? Sing with joy now, our God is for us. The Father's love is a strong and mighty fortress. Raise your voice now, your love is greater. Who can stand against us if our God is